I enlisted in '99, went to boot camp in Great Lakes, and graduated boot camp, and I think that was the most memorable event was graduation, because I wasn't just a civilian. I realized that I was in the world's finest Navy. I was a sailor. I was, I was something. And my first duty station was up in Bethesda, Maryland, at the National Naval Medical Center there, and spent about 2.5 years there. And then September 11th happened. I had orders to become a lab tech, to be stationed in Portsmouth at the Naval Hospital there where the school was for lab tech. And when September 11th happened, I was called out with a critical core team that I was attached to out at the Naval Hospital there in Bethesda to render aid to the injured at the Pentagon. And with my experience there, when everything kind of calmed down, Manpower gave me a choice of either going to school and getting my degree, or go with the Marines. And I volunteered to go with the Marines. I cut my orders and got new orders and went to Camp Lejeune at Camp Johnson in Jacksonville, North Carolina, and started field medical training technician for emergency trauma in the field. That was about 2.5 months. And upon graduation, they had asked for volunteers to go with the grunts, who were going to be attached to Marine units in the front line. And being a corpsman and being in the medical field since I was 17 years old, I had the knowledge and the experience of working as a trauma tech in the hospital. So I felt that my best position was to volunteer for the grunt unit, and trained with them for about 6 months. And then I found myself on a ship on my way to Kuwait in 2003. And that would be my first tour, was crossing the border in 2003, March 20th. And it took us 2.5 days to get to En Nasiriyah. And that was a big battle. They called that the Battle of the Bridges in Nasiriyah, where they had a ambush alley, I believe is what they called it. And it took, our track got hit, and we were on foot, and we had to fight through the city. And it took us a day to get through the city to the rally point on the other side of Nasiriyah. And that's when we learned that Jessica Lynch and the Army convoy got misdirected and was being held POWs. And our platoon had the great pleasure of giving security around the hospital that she was being stayed in, while the Army Rangers went in and brought her out and brought her to safety. So our unit was able to experience that. Then we pushed in. We had several casualties and several injured Marines that we had lost a total of 18 that day. And they kind of put us towards the back of the convoy going to Baghdad, and we were did a few missions, clearing out villages and looking for caches, and we didn't actually get into Baghdad. We were just outside southeast of Baghdad, and by that time operations were getting completed and we were pushing back south and heading back. Pretty much my first deployment.
You said first deployment, so you've had many?
Yes, I did 2 tours in Iraq and 1 security detail in Afghanistan. And my second deployment was a lot difficult than my first one. When I came home, I was put into headquarters battalion to take care of some family stuff back at home, and which was really hard for me because I was being taken away from my brothers and being put into another in headquarters battalion. So it was kind of difficult. And when I got back to Camp Lejeune, to headquarters, once everything was squared away here in, at home, they were looking for experienced corpsmen to go to this new small craft company that amphibious assault vehicles battalion was developing. And there was several corpsmen that put in for it and was getting rejected. They just, being so early in the push to Iraq, the invasion into Iraq, there wasn't very many corpsmen that were experienced. They were all getting out due to deployments and whatnot. And I found out that my CO, Major Whitnam at the time, was going to head this platoon, the small craft company platoon. And when I had heard his name, I volunteered. He is one of several brothers that I've met in my service that I will never forget, that I hold dear in my heart. And I did a workup with them for about 6 to 8 months. Got my brothers, my Marine brothers, medically approved for this deployment, and got their physicals, deployment physicals set up, all their immunizations, made sure that their dental was up to date, and I got to know these young guys. 80% of those guys were about out of high school, and I was one of 4 people that were in their mid to late 20s, and I was one of 2 people that had combat experience. So this unit was really young, was really just fresh out of boot camp, you know, just out of their schools. And we did our deployment workup for 6 to 8 months, and we were on a plane out of Cherry Point to heading to Kuwait, you know. And I was supposed to be deployed with my platoon, but the corpsman that was I was replacing had passed away. So they said, "Hey, we need you to go into the events party to replace this corpsman and get everything set up for our guys in 4th platoon to arrive." And that's when it really hit me. You know, I said, "Wow, I knew this guy," you know, and knowing that going into 2nd platoon's world with a corpsman that had passed away really hit home to me, hit hard. And I just had to tell him, I said, "Yes, I'll go." made another decision to head on out there and get my guys prepared and try to keep, I paid my respects and everything, but I had to keep that part outside of my mind so I can complete our mission, what we were there for. And we spent about 9.5 months in country with Small Craft Company up and down the Euphrates and Tigris River. And we spent about 75% of the time outside the wire, living in the elements. While doing that, you really get to know who you are and who your Marine brothers are. And if I had a choice to do it again, I wouldn't change a bit. I would go back out there, and we did a lot of good things out there. We really did. We spent a lot of times with the Iraqi people, and one of the stories I like to tell is that when I was asked, were you there for a reason, or were we even there for a purpose? And I said yes, we were there for a reason. I saw how the kids were being suppressed, was being bullied, was being manhandled by this tyrant. And one of the villages that we cleared out, we stayed there for about 4 or 5 days once we cleared out the insurgents. And about the second day that being there, the village elder came up to us and was thanking us, and they cooked us chicken. We feasted that evening, and while we were sitting with the villagers and everything, the elder said, well, in his language, I didn't understand what they were saying, but our interpreter was explained to us that this is the first time in years that he was able to see the kids swim in the water, play in the fields without beaten. Hard to say being raped. Just taken advantage of, and the village elder thanked us for liberating his village, and he prayed and blessed our unit to stay healthy, to continue our mission, and that's us. That will always forever be embedded in my heart, and that was the reason why I was there. That I could not see my kids living that way, and we did our 9 months out there. We had many injuries. We were in the front lines. We found a lot of caches. We did what we were supposed to do out there, and
Okay. Yeah. So whenever you're ready,
Okay.
Purple Heart recipient.
yes, I received 2 Purple Hearts in my second deployment, and received a Silver Star, which is the 3rd highest combat award to be presented to somebody underneath the Medal of Honor. Well, in January 1st, 2005, on New Year's Day, we were supposed to have that day off. I went into Haditha Dam, where my fob was at, and excuse me, I'm sorry, where our bolts and platoon was at Haditha Dam, and as I was walking down the street to go to our hacienda where we were living at, they said that a routine boat ride to warm up the engines on the boats and stuff, we got hit. That one of our Marines got injured, and they were on the way back. So we ran back. The Marine got hit in the leg. I patched them up. The other 2 Marines that was with me, I loaded them up on the Humvee, and they took them up on top of the dam where the battle aid station was at, where there was a further echelon of care for the casualty, for the injured. And I went into the hacienda. They said, "Hey Doc, we need you. We're going to go back out there where we got ambushed." I said, "Let's go." Got my med pack on and grabbed my my rifle, and we went back out there, and we got into another ambush when we got to the point where they got first hit, and we were able to embark our ground combat element on shore and started pushing forward, tracking the insurgents. And that's when we noticed about 4 to 6 bloody drag marks, and we followed the drag marks and got into another firefight. Everybody was okay during that firefight, and once that calmed down, we pushed forward again, not realizing that we had went too far from our boats at this time. And the bloody drag marks led into this little area that had 4 mud huts with a pump, was pumping water out of the river into the fields to water the civilians' crops. And myself, our radio man, and one of our officers walked into this area to where there was a wall off to our right-hand side, and the officer said, "Hey Doc, we need to move out of this area because there's a tin can sitting on that wall, and that's what the insurgents used to mark their IEDs." And at that time, I realized that the radio man was given the boat's coordinates at our position, and he didn't hear what the officer said. So I pulled on his trouser and said, "Hey, we need to get out of this area. We need to go back behind this hut." And as soon as we both turned around, that's when the IED blast happened, and it knocked the Marine into me, and me into the wall of the hut, and I was unconscious. And I remember coming to, and there was, AK-47s going off, RPGs, 203 rounds being shot off from our guys, M16 rounds. There's a distinct frown between the AK-47 and the American-made M16. So I knew that I was in the middle of a firefight. That's where I was laying. And I felt some burning on my right arm and down my leg, and I did a quick blood sweep and made sure that I had all my limbs and everything, and I was okay. And that's when I realized that Perillo was in between me and the IED. And I gathered my senses, and I low crawled to where Brian was, and he was unconscious. And I rendered aid, found that he was pretty tore up from the IED, and I was able to regain conscious of Brian. And I gave him more morphine for the pain and everything, and I bandaged up his right arm because he was partly amputated. And so I while the firefight was going, I dragged him from his flight jacket, his sappy plate jacket, and pulled him into behind the hut that we were at, and was given instructions to another Marine to help me keep him alive. And then that's when I heard the cry out for Corpsman, Corpsman up, there's someone else that got hit. And I went into the firefight, found the casualty, patched them up, and firemen carried them back to where Perillo was at. And while I was assessing both of their injuries, I heard the cry out again for Corpsman up. And that time, the officer was injured and got back into the firefight, and firemen carried him back to where the other two were and stabilized the officer. He had his arm pretty much amputated, and at that time our lieutenant had sent 2 runners down to where the bolts were, because the radio was destroyed from the blast. And so I can hear in the distance the boats coming up river to our position while we were fighting, and I instructed my Marines to pull a medevac, and we called back to the battle aid station at Haditha Dam that we were coming with 3 casualties. And once we got back, we evacuated. We left the area, went back to the boat ramp where the hacienda was at, and we loaded up our casualties. I stayed with Brian Perillo because he was the most injured. And as we were going up to the BAS, I had lost him. He, he didn't pass away, which was good at the time, because it kept my morale up and it kept me going. And we got Perillo and the other 2 to the BAS, and they had already had 2 helicopters coming in to medevac them out. And Brian was still coherent. He knew what he was doing. He was complaining about his pain. I gave him some more morphine and bandaged up, made sure his injuries was taken care of, and I knew he had internal bleeding. Well, while they were getting loaded up in the helicopters for their medevac, I was in the Humvee getting back down to the boat ramp, because we had gotten word that they were going back to pursue the insurgents. The fight wasn't over for us. We were all upset, pretty upset. And halfway down the Haditha Dam, going to the boat ramp, that's when one of my Marines on the Humvee noticed that I was bleeding. And I had told him, no, it's not my blood, it's someone else's blood. And he said, no, Doc, I can see your bone. And that's when I realized that my bone was exposed from one of the shrapnels from the IED. And the driver slammed the brakes on the Humvee, and the other Marine was giving orders to the hacienda, said, Doc's hit, we need to take him back to the BAS. And that's when I realized, that's when my adrenaline was going down, and I started feeling the pain, the burning of the shrapnel in my leg and elbow. And They brought me back to the BAS, loaded me up on the same helo where Brian Perillo was on, and I was, you know, trying to talk to Brian, and I had heard over the radio that that's when he had passed away. We were en route to El Asad to a medical hospital that was there for further medical treatment, and that's when we lost Brian. He put up a really good fight. I wear his bracelet every day. If it wasn't for him being where he was at, I wouldn't be talking to you right now. And it's been rough. Yeah, been rough. And because of that incident, that's because I received the Silver Star for that exchange of firefight that we had. Time, I guess. That's why I got a second Purple Heart. You know, I spent 3 days in El Asad getting medical treatment and everything, and I was trained that to look for like what they call PTSD, what they shell shock or battle fatigue in my platoon. So, and I started noticing a change in me while I was in Al Assad, and they gave me they asked me if I wanted to go back to Germany and surgically remove that shrapnel out of my leg, or I can go back to my platoon. And I had asked the docs, I said, well, there's been many people in Vietnam that lived with shrapnel in their deployments from Vietnam, and is there a way that I can continue and go back to my platoon? He said, well, we'll give you some antibiotics and stuff, and while it heals, you just need to take it easy for a couple of days. And I went back to my platoon. You know, when the second Purple Heart, my Humvee got hit with an RPG, threw me out of the back of the Humvee and got a couple bullet wounds in me, and I went back to my platoon after that. You know, my fight wasn't over. You know, and I not only wanted to go back to my platoon, I really wanted to go back there because of their morale. Because I knew if their doc had to get medevaced when I got injured, that they would lose the will to continue the mission and everything. And I love my brothers, and I couldn't see myself being separated from them. And so I went back to my platoon and continued. After my second injury, I had 3 more months in country, and that's when I noticed my PTSD and multiple concussions and stuff was affecting me. And my CO, Major Whitnam, knew and saw it within me, and he really took good care of me while I was out there, because he knew how important it was for me to be with my guys, and how important it was for my guys to be there for me.